A very good evening to those joining from India, and a good morning to Crockett and those joining us from the other side of the globe. It's so good to see Professor Crockett almost exactly after a month we last met. Now, to begin with, on behalf of Foundation for Creative Social Research, I invite all of you to a seminar on new materialism, explorations in religion, politics, and Anthropocene. We have Professor Clayton Crockett as the main speaker from University of Central Akranas, United States. Professor Manindra Thakur is the chair from Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And our senior research scholars is our discussants, Varun Vigmal, Ravikiran, and Kushal Nandwani, and I, Sanjana, will be moderating the session. The speaker will have 25 minutes, followed by the chair, who will have 15 minutes, and the discussants will have 10 minutes each. So let me give a brief introduction for the speakers of the day. Professor Clayton Crockett is a renowned scholar and currently a professor at the Department of Philosophy and Religion at the University of Central Arkansas. He is also the director of the Interdisciplinary Religious Studies program there. His areas of specialization and research include contemporary continental philosophy of religion, modern and contemporary Western religious thought, postmodern theology, psychoanalytic theory, and the Kantian sublime. Professor Crockett is a fellow of the Vesta Institute and its seminar on God and the Human Future. Professor Crockett's area of pedagogical interest includes modern and contemporary religious thought and philosophy, world religions, religion science and technology, theories of religion, and religion in America, among others. He is also a distinguished research fellow for the Global Center for Advanced Studies. His author and edited include Religion, Politics, and the Earth, The New Materialism with Jeffrey Robbins, Radical Political Theology, Religion and Politics After Liberalism, Doing Theology in the Age of Trump, a critical report on Christian nationalism edited with Jeffrey Robbins, The Future of Continental Philosophy of Religion, and Derrida After the End of the Writing being the most recent publication. His book, Radical Political Theology, Religion and Politics After Liberalism, was shortlisted for the American Academy of Religion Book Award in 2011 in the category of Constructive Reflective Studies. The chair, Professor Manindranath Thakur, is an associate professor at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His area of interest includes Marxism and religion, new religious movement, Indian politics, Indian knowledge system, philosophy of science and social sciences. He was one of the founding members of the group which established the Developing Countries Research Center of Delhi University, aiming to provide space between academics and activists of the people's movement. He has initiated a number of research programs aiming at making social sciences socially relevant, including Global Dialogue on Peace, Mapping Knowledge and Practice in Asia. He has also introduced a course on Indian intellectual traditions at the Center for Political Studies. He is currently raising an intellectual movement called Creative Theory, which aims at decolonizing the social sciences by engaging with non European philosophical traditions and linking philosophy to people's struggle for liberation. He has recently published a valuable book, Gyan Ki Rajniti, translated as Politics of Knowledge in 2022. Now, for the discussants, Varun Vigmal is a research scholar at the Center for Political Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His areas of philosophical and research interests include political philosophy, philosophy of mind, with special interest in consciousness studies, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science and religion, and politics. He is currently working on non duality as it manifests in politics and philosophy in Sikhism. Saripalli V. Ravikiran is a research fellow and assistant at the Center for Political Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. As a senior research fellow, he has worked on Dalit environmentalism in India and is currently working on spectacle sports and agrarian political economy, a study of codependence in coastal Andhra Pradesh as a part of his doctoral thesis. He is also conjecturing upon international political economy and eco-Ambedkarism. Kushal Nandwani did his bachelor's in political science and LLB from University of Delhi and LLM from Azim Premji University, Bangalore. His interests lie at the intersection of legal theory and science and technology studies. He will begin his PhD in History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Notre Dame in August 2023. No matter how quickly you want to finish the rounds of introduction, it always takes up a lot of time. But we welcome all the distinguished speakers we have. And now I would like to call upon Varun to introduce the objectives of creative theory.
Am I audible, Sanjana? Am I audible now? Okay.
Yes, Varun.
Thanks a lot. Yes, thank you so much. I think it's a pleasure. I've been following Professor Crockett's work since long now, and I must say that I've seen a lot of commonalities between the perspective that we are trying to develop as a group, namely creative theory group, and the kind of work that he's doing, with obviously with some differences. That is like will become much more clearer in the due course of time. But right now, I want to sort of explain the perspective that our group has, creative theory group has regarding religion, politics, and society. You know, how we understand the phenomena of religion and how we see it as intertwined with not just society but with politics. I think the group was formed, with the aim to sort of fathom the intricacies and the nuances of the word religion and its implication for the society. It sort of strives to unravel the way religion is enmeshed and entangled in society and politics, and how a nuanced understanding of religion is not just a prerequisite for academic clarity on the subject, but also for envisioning a better and decent society. The epistemic concerns or themes that the group engages in are twofold. One deals with religion as a site of conflict and contestation, as well as the domain wherein societal and cultural pluralism manifest. The second concern or theme is about comprehending the ontic/ontological component of religion, which is basically about fathoming the ontic reality as the source or core of religion. I will highlight what this ontic reality is. This second concern takes us into deep philosophical and metaphysical horizon, wherein one delves into the intricate debate of what constitutes and categorizes religion, as well as the question of whether there is an aspect of reality to which all religions and spiritual tradition takes us, which is what we are calling the ontic reality. That also constitutes the source and core of religious and spiritual tradition. And we are arguing that if that is affirmative, then we can assert that there is a lack in our conventional epistemological lens through which we have tried comprehending religion. In other words, it explores the limitation and myopic vision of traditional concepts and tools used in social sciences or social research that obsessively tries to comprehend religion only through classical or modern theorists like Weber, Marx, Durkheim, and Freud. This endeavor compels us to delve into the complex philosophical questions of religion and its relationship with reality, whether social or natural. And what we can learn from the contemporary debates in diverse disciplines like philosophy of mind or cognitive science, affect theory, continental philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, and of course, evolutionary psychology and biology. And how we can use insights from these varied disciplines to not just have a nuanced understanding of what constitutes religion, but also what is the association between religion and reality as it manifests in nature and society. This analysis has its basis in a mode of conceptualization in which reality is seen as layered, and different layers of reality corresponds to different epistemological tools. In other words, it considers frame utilized technology, which is nothing but a non-fixed or non-dualist understanding of reality. And it proposes that spiritual aspect of religion constitutes integral component of religion along with economic and political aspects of reality. And therefore, any perspective account of reality or epistemological tool ought to have notion of totalized ontology as its metaphysical counterpart. This method is deployed to get ground of different layers of reality. One layer of reality is empirical, in which deploying the method of natural sciences bears fruit. The other layer is social or cultural, wherein sociological or anthropological tools and methods takes us closer to social facts and truth. This idiosyncratic aspect in this mode of analysis or conceptualization is that it does not only stop at these two layers of reality, it goes ahead and argues that there are deeper layers of reality like psychological, consciousness, awareness, and cosmic layer that require ingenious methods and tools for unraveling the mysteries of such layers of reality. And through this mode of conceptualization, the group proposes that religion, apart from being a crucial element in social, political, and cultural analysis, also constitute an integral element of natural and philosophical analysis. The goal of the group is to create a dialogue between aforementioned disparate themes in religion, that is, between aspects and themes of religion that has a relation with matters pertaining to identity or community, having a bearing on issues of conflict and community identity formation, and the universal or spiritual core of religion being proposed, which is the ontic part of religion. So the ontic component of religion defines this as its spiritual component that needs both experiential and conceptual tools and methods to have access of it. It conjoins with the method used to fathom the enigma of consciousness. The main puzzle that group tries to solve revolves around the conundrum of fathoming the chasm between identity-centric component of religion and the spiritual or universal core of religion. It strives to explore the metamorphosis from religion as ontic and spiritual phenomena, which is inherently plural and universal, to religion as a tool for identity politics and hence subservient to ideology. In the process of fathoming this enigma, the group on religion and society transcends the limitation of disciplinary boundaries. In other words, it employs an interdisciplinary method and approach that takes as much from the framework and methods of philosophy of mind and sciences as it takes from anthropological, political, and sociological insights. That's it. Thank you. Sanjana?
I now would like to invite the chair, Professor Thakur, to invite Professor Crockett to give the lecture. So you're on mute.
Thank you, Sanjana, and thank you, Varun, for articulating the perspective of the group in a most lucid way possible. I welcome Professor Crockett once again to this group. As Varun said, that it is a creative theory group which has perspective on religion, or at least we are trying to evolve a perspective of religion based on the experiences of religion that we have on this part of the world. Broadly speaking, we may say that the dominant perspective in sociology or social sciences, informed by Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, find those perspectives not adequate enough to explain the experiences that we do have. And we would like to approach thinkers from India like Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Tagore, and their understanding of religion as providing certain kind of insights for a comprehension of this phenomenon. And as Varun rightly said, that we treat religion not as an epiphenomenon, but very much embedded in our everyday life and our life experiences. And in short, what we used to say, spirituality is as natural to human beings as sexuality. So it's a part of our ontic structure, it's part of our ontic being, it's part of our being. So with these words, I want to welcome you, Professor Crockett. I'm sure we will initiate a dialogue which will go long, and we will arrive on certain better understanding through your presentation. Thank you. The floor is yours, Professor Crockett.
Yes. I resonate very much with the creative theory group and how you and what you do, because I think that's very important. I have a PowerPoint, but I don't know if I need you to let me share the screen. My screen. Do I need that, or can I do that?
Yes, I will make you co-host, and then you can share your screen. Yes, now you can do this.
Okay, I will share my screen, and I will do this. Let's see. Sorry, I'll just take a second. And Okay, so my talk is on new materialism, explorations, and religion politics in the Anthropocene. And as some of you, Sanjana, Ravi mentioned, the course that I gave last month in February at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur was called New Challenges in Critical Humanities, Religion, Politics, and the Earth. And this was sponsored by a global initiative of academic networks that Professor Saswat Samedas and I proposed in 2019, which was approved. And I was going to come to Kharagpur in the fall of 2020, and then the COVID pandemic occurred. And so this was delayed, but fortunately I was able to come and give this course, which was an extraordinary experience. And the best part of it was meeting so many new friends in India and so many brilliant thinkers and researchers and students. So my book did not come through. I had a picture of the cover, but this is my newest book, Energy and Change, A New Materialist Cosmotheology, came out with Columbia University Press in 2022, so last fall. And meeting somebody from the waiting room. And let's see. What is new materialism? Well, I think that the perspectives that you mentioned that were limiting with Freud, Marx, Weber, and others are in some ways based on classical modern European materialism, which in many ways is atomistic, reductionistic, and deterministic. And I think that this modern materialism, in many ways, is a reaction against kind of Cartesian dualism, that is a body-mind dualism that was sort of set forth in very sort of representative form by Rene Descartes, who is seen as the first modern European philosopher. And so sometimes this modern materialism is resisted from a point of a kind of spiritualism that rejects matter, and sometimes it is critiqued more from within. But in the 21st century, a kind of newer philosophy called new materialism has emerged that has been influenced by 20th century philosophers Alfred North Whitehead, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Gilles Deleuze. And in this view, from this perspective, matter is not inert. Matter is not about reducing to smallest building blocks that then get built up. It is not deterministic in the sense that you can predict exactly what's going to happen using a starting point, but it is intrinsically dynamic, chaotically complex, and essentially indeterminate. This new materialism emerges in the 21st century out of what's called neo-materialism in the 1990s, and this word was coined by two theorists, one Rosi Braidotti and the other Manuel Delanda. Both of them were very strongly influenced by the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze. Delanda was an architect and sort of systems theorist, Braidotti a European feminist philosopher. And they coined this term to oppose the dominant linguisticism and social constructivism of late 20th century philosophy, especially continental philosophy. But to some extent, the philosophy of language was the sort of the primary theme of 20th century philosophy. So in the 21st century, ontology reemerges and a new way of thinking about matter as well as materialism emerges. And I think this word materialism is important, even though it opposes certain old-fashioned forms of materialism, partly because of that political charge, and there is a kind of neo-Marxist element to this. But some examples, Jane Bennett and William Connolly were both political theorists at Johns Hopkins University. Another university in Baltimore, Maryland in the United States, Catherine Malabou, French philosopher and student of Jacques Derrida, is an important philosopher associated with new materialism. And we've had a couple edited volumes, interviews, which I didn't list, but there's one called New Materialism, Interviews and Cartographies, by Rick Dolphin and Iris van der Tuin. And there's another volume called New Materialisms, Ontology, Agency, and Politics, edited by Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost. And so these volumes and some of these works have sort of crystallized some of this philosophical perspective. And I've been engaged with new materialism for about a decade. And this book, Energy and Change, sort of centers new materialism around energy transformation. So there's a kind of vitality to matter, there's a dynamism to matter, but many new materialist philosophers don't explicitly engage with energy and energy transformation. Of course, after Einstein, mass and energy are convertible, so energy is fully physical, in many ways material, and I would argue even potentially spiritual. And this is one of the ways that religion comes in here to this question and to this topic. What I do is I draw on some of the developments in non-equilibrium thermodynamics in the 20th century, and also that emerges later in the century in so-called dissipative systems, nonlinear chaotic systems. Basically, in classical thermodynamics, you had this idea of a system based on heat tending towards equilibrium, a movement from order to disorder, whereas I think some of the non-equilibrium thermodynamics that I've been engaged with sees how entropy or is like a reduction of gradients, a reduction of differences that gets set up, and there are various differences, temperature, pressure, chemical reactions, and that this reduction of gradient differences can, in many cases, produce structures as long as there is energy flow through a system. So drawing on systems theory, drawing on the work of Ilya Prigogine and others in what's called non-equilibrium thermodynamics, I try to bring this to bear on thinking about energy in new ways, and also draw on the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze in his masterwork, Difference and Repetition, because I argue that he provides a philosophical and theoretical framework to help us understand and make sense of some of these new ideas that were being developed even as he was writing, even though he doesn't use this language of physics in the same way, but he does talk about this in a very sort of striking way early in his fifth chapter, which is somewhat has been somewhat underread and underinterpreted. But I think it's significant and needs to be brought into contact with some of these other philosophies and theories. In any case, I'm going to switch and turn to political theology, because thinking about new materialism and energy transformation, also thinking about the ways in which religion and politics are entangled in terms of the earth and in the context of the Anthropocene. And of course, we also have this new synthesis report coming out from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is saying that we've crossed many of these tipping points and that we desperately need to act urgently and yesterday in order to sort of ameliorate the rise in global temperatures and many of the worst effects of climate change. So in so many ways, we're all interrelated given this context. But in the modern period, with secularism, we think that we can separate or split apart religion and politics. And so this discipline of political theology, or this theme of political theology, becomes important in the late 20th and early 21st century, and a kind of return to Carl Schmitt's political theology, and a kind of breakdown of the so-called secularization hypothesis. So I have a quote from Schmitt. Schmitt is obviously a conservative and also joined the Nazi Party. And so in many ways very controversial, but many of his critiques are incisive. And I think that's why he's being engaged in many cases, including mine, by people that do not want to endorse his conclusions. But says that in his little book, Political Theology, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, but also because of their systematic structure. So I argue that there is a systematic structure of religion and politics that goes through the modern period and the so-called secularization of European and American thought, and in a sense of world thought that was never fully accomplished or never completed. But if we want to think about this and give this some sort of theoretical tangibility, I would connect it to liberalism and say that religion, under the auspices of modern liberalism, liberalism wants to privatize religion and faith. And as John Locke says in his famous letter concerning toleration, religion must offer reasons anytime it wants to enter into the public sphere. So religion is a private affair, and we have this public reason, and that's sort of the idea of a kind of secular public political sphere to which religion has to adjust itself. My argument, and I think that this has never been sort of, the idea of this as being a separate sphere has never been true. It's been an ideal and an idea, but it's never been the case. It's always been interconnected and porous. But I think that now liberalism is breaking down due to limits on planetary growth. And what we're doing is we're reaching real limits, physical limits. This started in the early 1970s, if not before that. But energy resources, natural resources, becoming more expensive, becoming harder to produce, obviously with the ability of the atmosphere to absorb our emissions without radical transformation. And the interconnection of the breakdown of modern liberalism means that there's a kind of deprivatization of religion in this century, and in fact, at the end of the 20th century. And again, it's not that religion was ever fully privatized, but this is becoming more evident and more obvious. And many of these newer forms, public forms of religion, are illiberal, neo-traditionalist, and neo-fundamentalist. And I'm sure some of you can recognize some of those forms of religion, because these are some of the most extreme and also the most obvious. And so I suggest that modern liberalism splits apart into a kind of sentimentalized liberal politics of toleration, and a kind of underneath this, a brutal neoliberalized financialized capitalism. Again, this begins in the 1970s, or takes sort of more current shape in the 1970s. This neoliberalism works both in tension with and also in concert with neoconservative and neo-fundamentalist forms of religion. That is, the economic neoliberal capitalism sometimes is allied with these neo-fundamentalists and neoconservative forms of religion, and sometimes resists it, depending on which is going to be more profitable in the short term and ever increasingly shorter terms. As nations and corporations strain to grow, growth becomes more expensive and increasingly more inegalitarian. An inflection point in the 1970s, wealth is being concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, global warming is accelerating, and capitalism is imploding as it's coming up against physical planetary limits. So we're still growing, but the growth is slowing down, and it's becoming more concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And this is as, again, we're reaching these coming up against these planetary limits. I suggest that we desperately need new ways to think about change beyond the modern capitalist models of extraction, the extraction of energy, the extraction of resources for capitalist production, and also the financialization of energy in terms of money. But this money is also connected to energy and energy utilization, mainly in terms of fossil fuel and oil. An understanding of energy flow based on non-equilibrium thermodynamics that shows how matter, energy, and spirit are intrinsically interconnected is vital for a democratic politics in the Anthropocene. My argument is that what we call spirit is fully physical and fully material, as is energy. And this, we could talk about this. This is a little bit vague, but one of my arguments is that what we call spirit is a very sort of refined form of energy that is still material and still physical and avoids any kind of dualistic separation. This post-capitalist, post-liberalism should avoid any temptation to resort to traditionalism based on nostalgia for religious, cultural, and racial identities that fuel populist appeals to fascism. That is, I'm critical of neoliberal capitalism, and I'm critical of the sort of the machine that we are a part of. But I don't think that the answer, and again, this is also, sort of Schmidt's sort of nostalgia or appeal or desire for a certain kind of Roman Catholicism that then led him to support the kind of dictator Führer principle. I think that in some similar ways, people that are alienated from or see the problems with neoliberal capitalism can sometimes be very much persuaded by traditionalist identities and certain kinds of appeals to essentialized religious, cultural, racial identities that, again, can be a form of neo-fascism. So that's my presentation, my short sort of overview. I tried to touch on a few different things very, very briefly, and I don't know, unfortunately, enough about your group to know what would be very obvious and what might be more controversial and things that we would want to connect and talk about, but I look forward to hearing some of your responses. So thank you very much for having me here. I look forward to your engagement.
Thank you, Professor Crockett. I think
I'll stop sharing this.
Am I audible now? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Crockett. I think in a very short presentation, you have raised significant questions, and also you have thrown some issues on which we should have interesting discussion. I think the connecting energy with spirituality is something very interesting, and then connecting that with religion and the crisis of capitalism and the ecological crisis that we are facing. One point that comes very clearly is that you are talking about a totalized ontology. They are not unconnected things. Crisis of capitalism is not unconnected with failure of liberalism. It is not unconnected with the crisis of anthropocentric worldview. It is not unconnected with the science, the understanding of nature and understanding of natural reality, which has been thrown by Ilya Prigozhin and the chaos theory group. I think all these things are connected, and this calls for a more comprehensive understanding of the crisis that humanity is facing today. The post-Cartesian world is facing a new kind of crisis, and as Zizek keeps saying that probably we are at the end of time and new time is yet to begin. So we need to reconceptualize things for the new time to come, and religion is one of them, which is no more an isolated affair, which is no more which should no more be conceived as if secular versus religious or rational versus religious or spirituality versus materialism. I think these are all embedded and interconnected. So this interconnected perspective has to be looked for, and we have to keep exploring this. Our group always says that we believe in universals, but our universals are always emergentist. They keep emerging. We don't believe in a static universal. So I think this is very much what you are suggesting, that the universal has to keep expanding itself all the time. Thank you. So let me invite Varun to give his comments. Yes, Varun.
Am I audible?
Yes, Varun.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Crockett, and thank you so much, Professor Thakur, for giving me this opportunity to provide us my comments and to sort of uh, understand basically the larger corpus from which Professor Crockett is coming. I have, some comments and some questions. First of all, as I mentioned, I've been following Professor Crockett's work, and uh, and what I really like about Professor Crockett's perspective is that the sheer audacity with which he is exploring the new ideas, including the whole domain of not just physics but biology, and the quest that he has shown to understand the interdisciplinary nature of reality, like the way he has engaged with philosophy of science, for instance, and the way he's engaged with physics, philosophy of physics, for instance, chaos theory, and also a certain aspect of biology. Uh, that is what I really admire, and I try to embrace that. But when it comes to slightly nuanced understanding of his corpus, I have a few questions. For instance, in his recent work, not that recent, but he's been exploring, the corpus of speculative realism, for instance. And as far as I know, speculative realism is also a kind of school of thought which closely resonates with new materialism. I know that they are not exactly the same, but there is a commonality, and there are people belonging to the both the schools of thought. Like overlapping is there. For instance, when it comes to specifically one of the thinker within the corpus of speculative realism, for instance, when I explore the work of Quentin Messieu, for instance. And as in your recent work, you have explored these ideas of object-oriented ontology and speculative thought and all that. So my question is that there is a lack of, sometimes maybe it's lack of my understanding, but I see there is a lack of proper comprehension of a connection between how these philosophical schools of thought are overtly political. For instance, speculative realist school of thought tries to frame ontological questions. They say that Kantian correlationism is the problem, and it's basically a privilege. The privilege that we have given to the subject, we need to undo that privilege, and we need to go into the ontological questions of what reality is constituted of, and then there are differences between them. Like Catherine Malabau critiques that perspective and all, but I mean, for instance, that I mentioned that our group is coming from a perspective where we see reality as layered, and we are coming from a school of thought which I'm sure you must have explored, that is called critical realism, the school of thought of Roy Bhaskar. So I was wondering that Roy Bhaskar's school of thought, critical realism, when it perceives reality layered. So there are different ontological layers, but speculative realists, they also are realists, and they assume that the problem is subjectivism, but they don't explore the different ontological layers. They see reality in a very monistic fashion, which is fine. Monism is the philosophical locus through which we should try to understand reality. But what about the layers within that monism? For instance, you've been exploring Spinoza. I mean, even in this work, in your political theology after liberalism, you have taken a lot from Spinoza and Negri and all. Spinoza, as far as I know, was a dual aspect monist who has argued that there are multiple attributes to one monistic reality, and that monistic reality is one. So there is one substance, but different layers to that substance. So, what problem that I have regarding your analysis of that is that uh, it sounds as a very great experiment of a sort. It is great, it is exploratory in nature, and that I really admire because very few people have delved into such interdisciplinary endeavors. But sometimes maybe it's lack of my understanding. Sometimes I feel that there is no proper, sometimes there is a lack of coherence between questions pertaining to ontological reality and questions pertaining to core concrete economic political questions. And that is where many Marxists have criticized all this corpus of new materialism, post-humanism, and speculative realism. For instance, I was exploring the work of Matthew Flisfeder. So he has argued that we need to go. I mean, his title itself is very tantalizing. That post-humanism, we need to go beyond post-humanism. That is, we need to somehow bridge the gap between a dialectical understanding of reality, which Marx has sort of explored, and these new materialist insights. And the one work that I come across recently was by Thomas Nail. And Thomas Nail, his recent work, Marx in Motion, a new materialist understanding of Marxism, is exactly trying to do that. That he's trying to bridge the gap between dialectical materialistic paradigm and new materialist paradigm, and trying to argue that Marx was sort of a new materialist. And his idea of dialectics is about not just about gradual change, but about sudden swerve, sudden changes. And it's more of a chaos where sudden changes can bring humongous changes. There's not just a dialectical process. And secondly, in your understanding of ontological questions, I mean, I could be wrong, please correct me, but I think that you are using the idea of theology more metaphorically, in the sense that you use the idea of God as freedom or idea of God as potential, and you're taking that from Deleuze and post-structuralist thinkers. But what about, there is a school of thought called process theology, whole school of thought called process theology coming from Alfred Whitehead, including David Ray Griffin, Charles Hodgson, who have a very comprehensive and a very solid understanding regarding the idea of God and nature. I find it, I mean, there are problems when it comes to their political philosophy, I know, but when it comes to their understanding of theology, they have a very unified and coherent understanding of God. So I wonder that why have you not explored the idea of God in that sense? Maybe God as like a pantheistic or a panentheistic conception of God. And you are, I mean, be wrong again, but it seems averse to an idea of transcendence. And because you are coming from Deleuzian perspective, but when you see the work of the likes of Roy Bhaskar is also a realist, but he is going into the transcendental critique. He's exploring the transcendental critique of non-realism. He's going into the transcendental layers, and there his approach is more close to Whiteheadian perspective, who was a panentheistic perspective, which is both immanentist in nature as well as transcendental in nature. So it is more of a unified ontology that he's coming from. So I'm just wondering, it's also an exploratory mode that I'm into right now, but how do you reconcile your work with process thinkers? And process thinkers are also, there could be some problem when it comes to their understanding of politics, but they also argue that change of process is fundamental to material reality, which you are also espousing. Process is what precedes existence, essence, sorry. So how do you see these exploratory modes, which are parallel to your exploratory modes, but somehow goes more into concrete, abstract as well as concrete questions of political questions, as well as some of the more, eccentric or some of the more questions of, mind, nature, science, and reality. So I can come again because I have a few more questions, but due to paucity of the time, I think I should.
Yeah, second round. Yeah. May I invite Ravi now? Ravikiran? And then Kushal.
Am I audible?
Yes, Ravi.
Thank you, Professor Crockett. Thank you, Professor MN Thakur, and my colleagues and friends for giving me this opportunity to be one of the discussants this evening. As far as my concerns are concerned, I admire how Professor Crockett understands new materialism from the perspective of the way he the way he understood how new materialism is characterized by indeterminacy, non-duality, chaos, evolution, and becoming. However, I fear that we are moving towards a kind of new essentialism, and let me elaborate on this, because even in your book and in your interviews, many times you mentioned that going against the Carl Smithian understanding of religion, you were of the opinion that religion is essential to or natural to human beings. And even I draw my attention to Professor Thakur too, even where he too believes that spirituality is natural to ontic beings. So somewhere down the line, both Professor Crockett and Professor Thakur believes that spirituality, religion is essential to human beings, ontic reality. So in that sense, I wonder and I fear that somehow we are moving towards a kind of new essentialism. Okay, so I want both of you to address this, and because this is going against, because somehow down the line this new material, the concern of new materialism is non-duality or non-binarized understanding of realities, and de-essentialized understanding of humanity, and beyond and beyond the human question too. So somehow I want this to be addressed. Also, I felt that there is less emphasis you placed on Anthropocene. Say for instance, when it comes to, I want to know your thoughts more on climate change, for instance. So if you understand climate change from a traditional approach, it focuses on social and economic factors or human activities that contribute to global warming, such as burning fossil fuels, industrialization, and consumerism. So I want to know, how is new materialist approach different from this traditionalist approach to climate change? And say for instance, what I mean by this, in one of the articles presented in Eon journal, I've read this, that physical properties of planet, such as carbon cycle, composition of atmosphere, are equally responsible for climate change. They also emphasize on importance of non-human actors such as oceans, which absorb large amounts of carbon dioxide and regulate Earth's temperature. Factors that can affect the ocean's absorption of carbon dioxide include temperature, acidity, and circulation patterns. For instance, warmer oceans may absorb less carbon dioxide. More acidic oceans may make it more difficult for marine organisms to build shells, uh, which could disrupt the food chain and ecosystem. So I can go on adding the examples, but the point is that I want to know how this sort of understanding, how new materialism understands and opposes this traditionalist understanding of climate change. Also, one of the interesting arguments that you brought this evening is an understanding of energy flow based on non-equilibrium thermodynamics. In that is that shows how matter, energy, and spirit are interconnected, is vital for any democratic politics. You mentioned that, or in other words, you believe that spirit is fully physical and fully material, as is energy. So I can relate this to my work, Dalit environmentalism or eco-Ambedkarism. I feel that this idea is manifested very clearly in Dalit and lower caste environmental practices, which believe that energy, spirit, and matter are non-binarized in a non-dualistic terms. So and these sort of practices Dalits and lower caste used as part of their socio-cultural, economic, and political assertions against Brahminical and upper caste practices, right? So however, perhaps this is the paradox of post-human conditions. These practices are liberatory in one sense, but are destructive and oppressive in many ways too. Let me come again. Some of these practices are patriarchal and speciesist. So this is the paradox, and ambivalence of the postmodern human condition. So how do you see this? How do you think that we can address this, where matter and energy is being understood in a non-dualistic terms when it comes to when it comes to the Dalits and lower caste environmental practices, and they use these environmental practices as an assertion against upper caste. But then again, this cannot be taken as they are. Indigeneity as a problem in itself, as because these practices can also be seen from a social hierarchical or reinforcing certain other social hierarchies which are patriarchal and which are speciesist. Okay, so maybe because of the paucity of the time, I would stop here and I'll come back maybe if a chance comes. And thank you for the opportunity.
Kushal, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you.
Thakur for having me here and the whole creative theory group. I think I'm a new in having me and giving me this platform to speak today. And secondly, thank you, Professor Crockett. I think in many ways you are raising issues that are crucial in relation to the current Indian politics and the whole idea of religion. So I think we are going through that kind of a period where we need to rethink religion. So your work in that sense is very relevant for us.
Recording in progress.
I wish to focus on two specific points, even though you have not dealt with these points in more detail in the presentation, but I think the presentation was taken from specifically a book on radical political theology, and there are certain themes with, I mean, your discussion of Schmitt and neo fundamentalism, and those points are, I think, clear in radical political theology, and I'm drawing from there. And the second thing that I wish to talk about is on the question of law. Again, you have not spoken about law today, but it's part of the larger corpus that you are working with, and your idea of a radical democracy. How can we think it with new materialism, and law is part of it. So I'll come to that. I'll begin with the presentation on with your point on religion, and I want to sort of draw a parallel with your work and Sabah Mahmood's work. And I mean, in a very clear and in a very straightforward sense, I want to ask you, what do you mean by this neo fundamentalism? Because the three possibilities that you articulate in your book, one is a Schmittian possibility, which is which goes towards conservatism. Second is the liberal idea of a binary between religion and politics and personal and private. And the third is the alternative that you are offering. But there is, I think there is another alternative in the writings of Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmood, where they are talking specifically Sabah Mahmood's book on politics of piety, in which she is locating the practices of women in Europe, and how she's talking about how this politics or this movement is not, it does not center on this binary of private and political, because ethical practices are inherently also political practices. And Varun said that you use religion metaphorically. I don't think I agree with that entirely, because you do talk about how these concepts like freedom and others are inherently theological concepts. But still, I think there's a difference between your work and Mahmood's work, because Mahmood, she's clearly saying that the practice, for instance, practices like praying for 5 times a day is an inherently political, it's a practice that is inherent to the constitution of subjectivity of these women. But so your idea of a religion without God or a religion without religion is still very different from Sabah Mahmood's work. She says that the piety movement is she uses the word, what's the word she uses? That it's a mix of religious practices and secular practices. So she says that these women borrow the secular ideas of time and history, but they also don't agree with the liberal understanding that praying for 5 times a day is just a practice that you can either choose or you can submit to. Whereas she's saying that it is actually by praying by 5 times a day that I can even think about going beyond religion, that I can even think about critiquing religion in a way. So in that sense, it is constituting the subjectivity of these women, and God is constituting. So they're not dismissing God, but they're also not a fundamentalist understanding of God. And I think not very long ago, we had this incident in India where two girls in Karnataka were stopped from wearing hijab. And again, the discussion in India was around this question of hijab and whether should they be allowed or should they not be allowed to wear in this agency. But nobody talked about this aspect that Mahmood is bringing, that this is hijab is constituting their subjectivity, but they are not fundamentalist for that. They are still secular in some very important. We think of religion as a static, but religion is a historically constituted discourse in which there is possibility of flux, there's possibility of change, and then sort of drawing a parallel with your work on religion without religion. So what do you think about that? And I think for that reason, in your understanding of religion, there's a certain kind of Eurocentrism, because as Mahmood also says that this understanding that practicing for praying is just a conscious choice that an agent makes is a very Protestant Christianity, that kind of an understanding of religion that she critiques. The second thing that I want to talk about is on the question of law. Now, there is, again, here I want to draw a parallel with your work and so like Alexander Lefebvre, his book, 2008 book on image of law. And I think there is a commonality in both of your thinkings, in the sense that you're saying that liberal legal frameworks don't work because, as Agamben shows us, there is a state of exception that over a period of time becomes the norm, and that people have lost faith in legal institutions because of capitalism and favoritism. And then there is the other alternative that you're talking about is that of theological readings of law, in which God and the idea of transcendence dominates. And thirdly, you're talking about what you call, following Agamben, as a pure law, or a law without law, where you draw this idea of the unconscious. And unconscious is basically a space through which we can think about law creatively. And there's a similar concern that worries Lefebvre as well, because I think what you're commonly trying to do is you're saying that how do we decenter, or how do we kill the head of the sovereign, so to say, with the idea of law, right? If we can follow Foucault. So how do we think of law creatively? And Lefebvre, there in his book Image of Law, he talks about three legal philosophers, Echelehart, Dworkin, and the third is Habermas. And he says that all these are Kantian because they have a pre-given understanding of good. So, for instance, in Dworkin's legal writings, there's the idea of a chain novel. Now, what is a chain novel? Dworkin says that in chain novel, what happens is that one person does not write the novel, but it's as if I write one chapter, and the second person that comes will know what I am talking about and will follow on the novel. So, in that sense, everything is pre-given in Dworkin and Hart and Habermas, as opposed to in Deleuze. And he says that Deleuze is for that reason post-Kantian, and he's talking about what does a judge exactly do, and he draws on Deleuze's idea of event and Bergson's idea of perception and memory. And he says that when judge is deciding, is actually being very creative, because it's not as if the judge calls for all the law books and all the all the jurisprudence that exists on a matter, and then looks through it and then says that, okay, this present case fits this narrative. That is not what happens. When an event happens, so when a person dies on the road, there's an already connection that we are making between law and... Yes,
Kushal.
Yes, sir.
Let's have, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just
questions.
Yeah. Okay. So how is that different? And in both of your works, there's a problem that where does this creativity end? Where is it leading to? So can we constantly be post-Kantian in that sense, or do we need an idea of good? Because that's a criticism in Lefebvre's work, and I think that can be a criticism for your understanding of law as well. So that I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kushal. I think Crockett has a full bucket of questions, and I'm sure it's very exciting. So, Varun, it's a good idea to request him to answer in the first go, then have another round of questions, right? So, would you like to respond to these three persons, and then we'll collect more questions for you?
Sure. And I don't think that I have time to do justice to any of the three, much less all of them. But these are great questions and, really engaged and really crucial. And so just as I wrote a few things down to try to respond, Varun, I am very critical of speculative realism, and I would distinguish that from new materialism. I think that this object-oriented ontology is problematic. It goes too far in its anti-Kantianism, and it does kind of flatten. He talks about a flat ontology, and the risk is that we do lose these layers that you mentioned with Bhaskar. I don't endorse some monism. And you talk about Spinoza, and of course I'm reading Spinoza through Deleuze, and I don't think Deleuze is monistic either. I think that there's a very easy sort of common misconception when Deleuze is talking about a plane of immanence, that we think that it is a reduction of something to something, that is a reduction of the transcendent to the immanent. And that is not what Deleuze means by this, because it is not in opposition. A plane of immanence elsewhere talks about a kind of plane of composition and contrasts this actually in one of his books on Spinoza with a theological plan. So it's more about an epistemology or even a way of thinking working against the idea of bringing in something from elsewhere, like superimposing something on something. So the immanence is more of like trying to think from within the context itself, even though the context itself is always differentiated and always multi-layered. And so I don't think, for me, that this is in any way a flattening or a monism, although I understand that certainly for, at least that's my reading of speculative realism, and that's my critique of speculative realism. Part of it, I think that we always need to engage the most abstract theoretical questions as well as the most concrete economic and political questions. And I think we always struggle to distinguish one from the other. And I guess I confess I don't know what it means to say theology is a metaphor or just a metaphor. Maybe if you say God is a metaphor, that makes a little bit more sense. But I'm also trying to redefine God. And in this book, in the Energy and Change book, I say that God is change, or at least I say that that's the best way I can, define or think or explain God, and that's open-ended. And I think there are links with process theology, with panentheism, and I talk a lot about Catherine Keller's work in the last chapter of that book. I also talk about Mary Jane Rubinstein's extraordinary work on pantheism and pantheologies. So I think there are points of connection. I think that process theology and also liberation theology are various species of radical theology, even though I come out of more of an American death of God radical theology context, but I think there are these important links. You mentioned Nail's work, and I haven't read this book, but I have read some of his earlier work, and I think that that is a great issue. I think there is a new materialist Marx. I think that John Bellamy Foster's Marx's Ecology is a work that sort of helps us in that direction as well. And I think that more work needs to be done with that, including a return to Althusser's late work on the philosophy of the encounter. I think that there's a really rich vein there. And then turning to Ravi with an essentialism, I mean, I don't know what it means when I say that religion or spirituality is intrinsic to human beings, and you say that that's an essentialism, or it sounds like an essentialism. I guess compared to what? Because what wouldn't be essential to human beings, or I guess intrinsic, if we want to make that distinction? I mean, I would want to work against any kind of binary dualism, any kind of essentialized, like determined reality in terms of the determination of what religion or spirituality or politics or ethics or any of those would mean. But I think that at the level of human being, at least, if we're talking about that, I don't know how we avoid, again, ethical, religious, social, theoretical, philosophical and again, religious questions. So again, I guess it would be essential compared to what, or distinguished from what. With the Anthropocene, I think that's a really great question. Actually, I think that's really crucial, and it goes back to the idea of a post humanism that Varun was talking about. That in fact we're both post humanistic and post humanistic, or that we need to be both at the same time. That there is this paradox and ambivalence running through us, and I think that Tim Morton, who is my favorite, probably of the object-oriented ontology group, talks about a kind of necessary hypocrisy. We're always hypocritical because we're never pure, and because we can never simply get at this one perspective, and that's the right perspective, and that there's always these multiple perspectives, and they're not, as much as we try to integrate them, they're never completely integrated. And so I think Latour helps me a lot with some of this ways to think about complex causality or actants of non-human actors, a kind of new agentialism, and this also gets into Karen Barad's work, which I draw on in my newest book some, but is very important influence for me. And so I want to say that yes, what you say about Dalit practices, I want to affirm that. At least as a possibility. I talk a little bit about indigeneity in terms of Amerindian groups, and mention the Brazilian anthropologist Viveiros de Castro. I also try to talk about voodoo and voodoo religion in Haiti as this kind of complex, new materialist or non-dualistic kind of way to think about matter, energy, and spirit, as well as the Neo-Confucian tea philosophy. So I think that's a great question, a great site, and a great place to look for these practices and see how they're at once political, they're religious, they're spiritual, they're potentially, new materialist, or at least potentially non-dual in the sense of like non-hierarchical and anti-essentialist. And I guess that's how I read Sabo Mahmood's work as well, turning to Kushal. And this question of thinking about religion in a more complex way. I accept the critique that I am Eurocentrist and Eurocentric in terms of my thinking through and about religion, certainly in the Radical Political Theology book. But I also think that there is always these mix of religious and secular practices. And in fact, this is going back to Olivier Wa's book on Islamic fundamentalism, saying how Islamic fundamentalism draws on these, secular ideas that are imported from Christian fundamentalism. And so it's not pure, it's not Islamic, it's not, if you go back to try to trace this historically. And so I think that we're always inventing new practices, and that they are constitutive of our subjectivity, whether we call them God, whether we call it ethics, whether we call it good, whether we call it spiritual, and that they are inherently political. And it's sort of having the complexity of being able to try to take that into account without reducing it. And of course, anytime we talk about something that's so multi-layered, we can't ever do justice to all of the layers. But I do think that, as you said, with the hijab in India and in everywhere, that these are both religious and secular practices at the same time, and they are constitutive of subjectivity, and they are ethical. Even if I don't have a substantialized belief in God, that doesn't mean that that's not what these beliefs and these religious and spiritual beliefs and practices do. And in fact, you're right, we shouldn't start with beliefs, especially since belief is the center of Protestant Christianity. And I'm trying to critique that also, but somewhat from within, which is limited and limiting as well. So this question of law is a really fascinating one, and I agree with it. I agree with the idea of law being sort of opened up and being creative and being more like an event, rather than just simply, being like trying to get rid of law. even though law is a very complex question in so many levels, in so many ways. And there's also a kind of psychoanalytic, sort of amplification of that, mainly through Lacan, that comes out in that book and then in others of my work. But I like the way that you talk about a judge's decision as being a kind of Deleuzian event. And then the question that you asked, where does creativity end? And do we need an idea of the good? Well, I think that for Whitehead, going back to the first critique, that the good is a kind of creative lure, or is a kind of lure for a kind of creative novelty. And so I don't think we want or need, or at least it doesn't seem credible to me to have this Platonic form of the good that would then sort of provide the model for the acts that we do and the thoughts that we think and the practices that we perform. But I think that the creativity is in kind of like searching for or trying to produce a kind of goodness, but not in a kind of oneness or a replication, but in a kind of always multiple and changing form. So that's my quick sort of response to these three. And like I said, I know I didn't do justice to any of them, but I think these are great engagements and vital questions, and I appreciate them very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Crockett. I think we're going great. They are very serious questions and need real good discussion, and we may need to have another round of discussion focusing on specific questions at some stage, as I think this question of essentialism is very crucial to the kind of perspective you are talking about. Similarly, the idea of law and how law and religion are interconnected and what kind of relationship is there between the two. Let me request other people to raise hands if you have any question, and we can go for another. How much time do we have, Varun? For another half an hour?
Yes, half an hour is there. Yeah.
Right. So we can take few questions, quick questions, short, and no long comments, please. Yes, Mallikarjun. Yes, Mallikarjun.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that spirit is fully physical and fully material. So how would one differentiate it from sort of a complete swing of the pendulum to the other side? I mean that we critique formalism and sort of representationalist philosophy, and does it devolve into, when we speak of the body, do we reduce it to biological principle? And and I wanted to just understand your comment where you said matter, energy, and spirit are interconnected, and this is vital for democratic politics in the Anthropocene. So, like, what does it mean for politics or Anthropocene in this sense that if we bring in a vitality to matter, or this we spiritualize matter, what kind of implications are we looking in politics? I mean, in Anthropocene, perhaps I can understand, we can say it provides us a framework to move away from consumerism as the liberatory sort of principle. So these are my questions, and I think to just a small comment on what Kushal was saying, and what you responded, that there seems to be a tension within, like, for example, in my creative search to not follow the model, but I still need certain broad outlines, right, within which my creativity functions. Otherwise, it's very difficult to say where the line is. Thank you.
That's a great point. Thank you. So, I mean, part of having models is having inspirations or having teachers. So it's like, who are you going to follow or who are you going to learn from? And so for me, Deleuze talks about this kind of apprenticeship in philosophy. And so to take Deleuze as a model philosopher, to think with and then try to think beyond. And I think, again, just being in India, learning about Ambedkar, I think is a kind of a model. for some of these questions, especially in social political terms. So I think that's, yeah, imagination is never just open and free, and there's no constraints. So you have to have these constraints, and then it becomes who chooses and how. But that's a little bit abstract. But then these questions are always, I'm trying to avoid a kind of reductionism when I say spirit is fully physical and material, because I'm trying to say that matter and physical reality is energetic, and it's never, it's never reducing something to something, right? And that how can I say? When I'm talking about Zhang Sai, who is a Neo-Confucian philosopher, and he's a philosopher of qi. And qi is sometimes translated as energy or psychophysical energy. And he uses this word gods and demons. And usually in Chinese, like they're kind of superstitious or kind of like way, but he means something like, at least this is the secondary research I've been looking at. He means something like inscrutable, that there would be something inscrutable about qi, at which point you would insert some of this spiritual language. And so I think that there's, in our material reality, it's not that everything is spiritual in this kind of like paint everything with one brush, but I think that in everything, in every process, or in every situation or every entity, there are aspects that are, we call inscrutable, that are paradoxical, that are strange, that are eerie maybe, and that we could sort of connect spirit to some of those points and say that it's never not material, it's never not physical, but we're always talking about energy and energy transformation in a very, again, non-equilibrium, dynamic, not even thermodynamic way. When you talk about spiritualizing matter, yeah, I mean, the danger is vitalism in a political sense, and vitalism and its effect on at least European politics in the 20th century is certainly something that many are aware of and many are cautious of, and I take that under advisement. At the same time, as you mentioned with the Anthropocene, I think that with indigeneity, and especially with Viviares de Castro's work with Amazonian Amerindians, you have this kind of way to understand an indigenous perspective much more, in a much more complex and I think sensible way that makes sense. And that this is not a reduction, this is not a kind of nostalgia or an exoticism or a kind of romanticism of the other, but this is a deep and credible way of thinking about the world that Viviares de Castro calls a multinaturalism. That's not the same as our sort of common humanistic multiculturalism. And so when we adopt that, and again, it's not that these other questions and the other issues just go away, because we still have to hold on to them, and that it's not for me an either or, and neither is sort of essential, but it's like some of these moves, seeing what they open up for new possibilities of thinking, of living, of acting, of resisting. And in some ways it's experimental, but it's not experimental, as you said, just like, free for all. So that's my best response, but thank you. That's a great question.
Yeah, we can take some more questions. I can see Swami Syamanand around. Swamiji, would you like to raise something? Is it anyone else? Yeah. If nobody has a question, then I may have second round of it. Varun, if you have something else to Sorry.
Yes, sir.
Arnav
Yes, sir.
Chakraborty. Let me check Arnav, then you can come in. Yeah, Arnav. Arnav?
Thank you. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for arranging this. I met Professor Crockett at the GAN course at IIT Kharagpur, and it was like a very like erudite experience. So I had a question about the last one was relation to it being fully material and physical, and what Professor Crockett like talked about spirit, like matter being associated with like matter being changeable and transformative. As we associate change with like certain kinds of movement in this aspect of spirit being fully like material and physical, how does the concept of the vibration of particles uh, like feature in this aspect of move as related to movement and change? Because vibrations were studied like from the early days of Einstein, and even later by some like Frankfurt School ex scholars like Wilhelm Reich, and then after in the post-war period, I think Wilhelm Reich was one of the figures who actually uh, worked on vibration from more pseudoscientific points of view, like, the points of view, but still, uh, like the contemporary scientific work on vibration is more like concerned with the experimental part, as in the Large Hadron Collider experiments. So I wouldn't go as deep as that, but I would like to ask that like if Professor Crockett could elucidate on the vibration part and how it is associated with movement and change in the transformation of matter to energy and possibly to spirit. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Arnab, and it's great to see you again. And really was wonderful to meet you in Kharagpur. I think that this gets into very deep questions of quantum mechanics. And as I've said, I'm very much interested in from a layperson's perspective, but also learning from Karen Barad's work. And obviously with Einstein, matter or mass and energy are convertible at the square of the speed of light. And in terms of quantum mechanics, one of the things that we've sort of discovered is that, like, from a certain perspective, particles aren't particles. They're just the concretizations of energy. And it's like and then there's certain discrete levels of that. And so in physics, we had the standard model of particle physics, which was confirmed by the discovery of the Higgs particle by the Large Hadron Collider about a decade ago. But the standard model is messy. It's baroque. It's really strange, and it's unwieldy. And I think that it's not that it's wrong, but it's that I think that there's something wrong with this idea of trying to sort of, these are the fundamental particles, these are the smallest little bits, and we're just going to scale everything up from what I think we really need to understand from quantum physics is that it's really how how energy transformation and vibration is constant. It's constantly moving, constantly transforming. It's never static. It's never inert. It's just relatively more stable, or what, I mean, using a word from biology, metastable. Something would be metastable. It would have a certain apparent stability, but it would also, the dynamism would still be sort of churning within it and all around it. And so I think that you're right that there have been philosophers and there have been all, attempts to try to think from some of these earlier revolutions in 20th century physics and relativity and quantum mechanics. However, I also think that because of the ways in which sometimes, quantum mechanics got used to spiritualize in a certain way, like the Tao of physics. This is some Asian mysticism, and I think that did a lot of sort of disservice, because the physicists themselves said this is ridiculous, and a lot of the people that were advocating that didn't really understand, quantum physics, didn't really understand the physics, and I don't understand the mathematics, but I'm trying to understand the concepts, and so at least for me, Barad gives me a kind of a framework and a theory to try to make it make sense as best I can without resorting either to kind of classical reductionism or this kind of mystification or throwing your hands up in the air, which is what, they said, a lot of the physicists said, just shut up and calculate. That's what Feynman said, they told him, because you can't understand it. It doesn't make sense. And so I think trying to integrate the material and the spiritual together in a way that doesn't just spiritualize. That would be the bad sort of transcendence that Deleuze is against, would just be taking the phenomena of what we observe with quantum, subatomic particles and then just spiritualize that, but actually trying to work as best can within that and see how it's always already material, spiritual, because it's energetic, and because it's energetic, energy is always transforming, and how, I mean, even just going back to electromagnetism, how an electrical field is generating a magnetic field at right angles at the speed of light, and that's something that Einstein, Maxwell speculated, and then Einstein showed. So yeah, I'm just to speak to that a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
So can I ask two questions?
Who is this? Is it Varun? Yeah, Varun, please.
Sorry for this interruption, but you mentioned Karen Barat's work and her work on quantum mechanics, and specifically, if I'm not wrong, this book called Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics Entanglement. But I was wondering whether, are you aware of this book by political theorist Alexander Wendt, Quantum Mind and Social Science, and the differences between the perspectives from where Karen Barat is coming and where Wendt is coming? If I'm not wrong, Karen Barat is using a different epistemological framework than Wendt, because Wendt is using Newman and Wigner's interpretation of quantum mechanics, which resembles pan-protopsychism, which is also non-reductionist in nature, but it resembles a certain kind of pan-protopsychism, which is not the mainstream position in physics, of course, but some of the physicists and some of the philosophers mind now flirting with it. So what is your take on that? Like, are you aware of that position, and are you aware of the differences? And second, not directly related to this question, but I was wondering that in your book, Radical Theology, you have explored the work of Tomoko Masuzawa and these people who argue that the religion is not a neutral term; it's not innocent, and the invention of world religions, they have argued that it's not an innocent and neutral term. But you and for people like Arvind Mandir have been arguing that post-colonial societies should get rid of the term altogether. Should get rid of the term religion altogether, because it's not innocent and it's not neutral, and it has a genealogy which is very much insidious in nature. And we should start conceptualizing post-colonial traditions or Indic traditions as philosophies rather than religion. Because the moment you start conceptualizing Indic philosophies as religion, the antithesis to that is secular. And you tend to sort of fall into this trap of religion secular binary. How do you, how do you take the position that we should get rid of the cap of religion in the Eastern or Indic tradition? And very small question, another, is that, Akhil Bilgrami in his work, Political Possibilities of Romantic Period, have argued that romantics of a certain time period, their worldview or their metaphysics, because of its pantheistic inclination, had the possibility of a new Peter Stake and all these romantics, and I've argued that in a certain way, commercial capitalism and a certain kind of Christianity got converged, and that paved for a kind of religion or a kind of spirituality where God was banished. So God was banished from nature, God was banished from the social. So, in my understanding, that kind of conceptualization resonates with sort of panpsychism, pantheism of sort. What is your take on that? Are you in tune with Akhil Bigrami's proposition, or do you have some differences? Small question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, not a small question. So I don't know the book that you have referenced, but I'm aware of some of the newer engagements and proponents of panpsychism. And I think that it's a very interesting question. I tend to be, I mean, I don't think you can completely eliminate it. I tend to be a little bit skeptical. My impression or my sense is that consciousness is more of an emergent phenomenon, but it partly depends on definition and how we want to how we want to define psyche, right? If psyche is a mind and a consciousness like human beings have, then I don't know what it means to say that an atom has a mind or a quark has a mind, right? That doesn't, I don't know what that means. I do understand that some of the ways that the I guess the collapse, the measurement problem, the collapse of the wave function is tied to consciousness. And Barad does not go there. She says it's the apparatus that makes a cut. And I think that we can't eliminate the possibility that consciousness is part of that, right? But I also, that's, for me, doesn't seem to be the most likely or the most reasonable explanation. But I understand why people are coming back to this, and it's not something that I think we should dismiss out of hand. But I do think we have to be very careful about some of the claims that if we do make that come out of that. And I guess I want to say something more general. Well, I want to say a couple of things generally. One is that I don't think that any philosophy in itself is either safe from political appropriation and some really bad political actions, applications, and inactions. I also don't think that, we could say bad philosophies can also have very positive effects politically and socially. And we could say this also personally on our autonomy and our subjectivity, right? That I don't think there's a kind of purity or kind of like an equation where we can say if we get the right theory, then we'll have the right political practice. So I'm skeptical of that. Also, yes, religion is not neutral. Religion is not a neutral word, but neither is philosophy. Neither is India. Neither is like language. I mean, the fact that we're speaking English as a result of modernity and organization, all of these kinds of things that we've inherited. Like we've inherited all these things, none of which are neutral. And all I can do is try to speak, try to think from where I am, taking into account as much as I can, take in and take seriously. And then it's a question of, right, what differences make a difference, or what becomes important or significant or vital in this or that conversation or discussion. And I think that for some contexts and for some people, religion is absolutely needs to be not centered, not essential, not where we start from. And I think that for others, maybe it can be. I guess for me, the best way I can sort of say, here's the biggest problem is, neoliberal capitalism. And it's not, I mean, capitalism has always been bad, and many of its effects has always been hierarchical and unfair. But in the sense of how it's been morphing into what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism, savage capitalism, whatever, this is destroying us, even though we're also still who we are because of it. And like I think was mentioned earlier with Zizek, I mean, he likes to he often quotes Frederick Jameson's, the quote attributed to Jameson, although I'm not sure if Jameson actually said it, but that it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than an alternative to capitalism. That we don't know how to imagine doing something differently. And so it's trying to imagine doing something differently, but not completely cutting or pretending that we can get rid of what came before, what we've inherited, because we've all inherited all of this stuff. And one of the things we're working is trying to disinherit, even though that we can never do that completely, and trying to find out what works and for what purpose. Religion in some contexts, panpsychism in some contexts, the apparatus, it's like we have these languages, and how we decide even within one language what terms to use is incredibly complex and messy. But I think it's important to struggle with it, and I think it's important also to be aware of these alternatives. So yeah, I would side with broads, but I don't think that discounts or disqualifies another way of interpreting it. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
I think should we call it a day? If there's no more serious question, I wanted Swami Syamanand to ask a question if he wants, since he is now visible. Or if he, Swami, are you?
Thank you. I'm in Banaras. There's some workshop here, and the network wasn't good, so I was actually just coming out of a big crowded place. But I heard the speech, and I heard Varun, a couple of other people. Very interesting conversation. I think this whole conversation has thrown up a lot of questions, very legitimate from different standpoints. The anxiety regarding the return to essentialism, at the same time, the option to keep it open to express oneself. I mean, any fear of return is only when you sort of presume that you have detached, and there are people who are sort of still living in organ belief systems which is aligned to their lives. I mean, I have met tribal people in different parts of the world where the river, the forest, the mountains are sacred, and their ecology is some kind of sacred ecology, and they have never broken away from it. So there is no return. It's for us outsiders trying to interpret their voices, their understandings, their episteme, their ontology. We are just outsiders. So similarly, but very, very interesting conversation. And thank you for connecting me.
Thank you, Swamiji. Let me try to bring out certain points which we can carry home and keep thinking about before I really end this up. I think that one of the crucial points that has been raised is about science and multiple interpretations of quantum and chaos through which we may arrive on certain kind of understanding of religion and consciousness. And simultaneously, there is another issue, I think. Is there any method or any possibility of exploring similar questions without going deep into the question of science, which is mostly based on the experiences, based on different kind of experimentations that spiritual people undertake. So, or for instance, the Buddhist method of meditation, vipassana, through that you are exploring the nature of the reality. So, what could be the uh, comparison, and what could be different kinds of findings on this rule? The second question is, and Varun raised towards the end, is that of the category. How far can we use categories as universals? And Richard King and others have argued, or Arvind Mandir have argued that, well, we should get rid of this Eurocentric categories, and maybe different cultures have used different kind of categories. We should not universalize. I think there we really need to contemplate that if we have to engage in dialogue, then there has to be certain kind of understanding of this issue. Maybe we take category as defined in a particular way. Maybe we open it up and redefine and consider this as tentative definition, or as Marx would suggest, that we can only treat categories as signifiers, not something definite. So instead of definition, we can think of the features of something, so that we keep the category open. And this is the second thing. Particularly, it is very important to think in this way if we want to talk of religion, which is a phenomenon having immense variations in both time and space. Third thing is the idea of consciousness, and Varun has this concern about pantheism, and we keep debating about this possibility of matter being conscious. How far can we treat matter as conscious, and what are the implications of that? And is that real, or is that something that we need to assume for certain kind of consequences that we want to think of as ethical consequences? This is something that keeps coming again and again. And as you rightly said, that we need to keep this open. This is not a closed question. We can't close this question, as our knowledge of the reality is still growing, and maybe we will come to this conclusion in near future in a much better way. Or maybe if we take different routes to arrive on this kind of question, we have different kinds of understanding of it. Third thing, and which I think is a very crucial thing, and where we really need to think more deeply, is the relation between neoliberal capitalism and religion, and how religion is being used by neoliberal capital to create identities, and also to divert the attention of people. Capitalism is undergoing a deeper crisis, and I think this time crisis is not in the realm of economy. Rather, there's a deep crisis in the realm of philosophy. If you look at 2008 crisis and the report published on that, most of the reports are suggesting that greed is the most crucial element. Now, greed is the foundation of capitalism, but now they are saying the crisis was caused by greed. So is there any other alternative that the capitalism has? And how will capitalism legitimize itself, except as it used to do earlier, claiming that capitalism will provide common good? If capitalism is not going to provide common good, then philosophically, how will it become sustainable? And if it is not sustainable, then it will be much more oppressive. And what I think is there's an emergence of techno-authoritarian state which collaborates with capital and then it becomes much more oppressive. And in that context, will religion will be a site of protest, or will religion will become a site of control? And that is something that I think we need to really contemplate. I think there are different kinds of responses. One, of course, as you said, is the fundamentalist religion, fundamentalism within religion, including the rise of right-wing politics. There is another kind of response that is new religious movements, new age movement kind of thing, where you move towards spirituality and kind of it provides some basis to sustain oneself despite all kind of problems. But there is a third. You rightly mentioned about liberation theology. I think I see a lot of possibilities there that probably people will move gradually towards that and start raising questions within religion and start thinking of a new form of religion which will be transformative religion. And probably as religion became at one stage a spirit of capitalism, Protestantism became spirit of capitalism, probably liberation theology is a spirit for socialism. Maybe and we are moving towards that. I can see that happening in many religions. And the last question, I think, is a question of indigeneity. I think there is a point that you made passingly, I guess, that indigeneity doesn't mean returning to the tradition. It only means that treating the philosophies of people more seriously, taking that more seriously. And space has to given to different kind of philosophies emerge in different social contexts. The universalization of such kind of philosophy may be very dangerous, but giving autonomy to them to think from there and then transform that into a more transformative worldview probably is something very desirable. Otherwise, there could be an oppressive universalism that will be very dangerous. I think these are the issues I thought are extremely important, apart from this thing on which I'm still not clear about this energy relationship. I think I will think about it a little more, and I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to engage in such dialogues. And this is the beginning of a dialogue. Now we have read some of your stuff. We went through some of your interviews, some of the podcast materials, but now this has initiated us into a more serious debate. And in near future, we will have another round of debate if Varun manages to catch hold of you once again. Thank you very much. Thank you. Varun, you want to say something as final word, or?
No, just so grateful to be with you. Thank you so much for having me, and I enjoyed the conversation, the interaction, and the way that you've sort of pulled everything together and pointed out how crucial and important it is. And I agree and resonate so powerfully with so many of the things that you say. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Varun, you want to give formal vote of thanks, or if Sanjana is here?
Sanjana has left, so I will be giving the formal vote of thanks.
Sure.
So I just want to thank everyone, specifically the speaker, Professor Crockett, for accepting our invitation. And I also want to thank Ravikiran, because it is through him I got to know about you. I mean, I've been reading your work and all, I've been engaging with it, but never expected a kind of formal kind of a conversation and this thing. So I'm really grateful to Ravi. I'm also really grateful to Professor Thakur for always, being so open about ideas and, providing us this opportunity to invite speakers from across the world working on different aspects of religion, politics, economics, philosophy, everything. And also like to thank Kushal for joining our group, Creative Theory, and providing really critical and creative insights, especially from the law, legal discipline. And
yes, welcome Kushal.
Sorry?
Thank you so much.
I just welcome Kushal.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the
And
opportunity.
I also want to thank each and every participant. And again, I think, as Professor Thakur mentioned, I think it should be a start. And I can just request Professor Crockett to be part of this group, like to accept our invitations in the future. And I think we share a lot of commonalities. Of course, differences are there, but differences is what make our whole discourse creative. So our group is all about creativity that incorporates criticality. So with these words, I would like to thank each and everyone, especially Professor Crockett, Professor Thakur, Kushal, and Ravi. So I think
Thank
we should
you.
end now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we can end this. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
See you.